My name is Sarah, and for most of my life, I believed I understood the world, how things worked, and what truly mattered. I was raised in a household where faith was recognized but not deeply practiced, a place where we observed holidays, casually mentioned God, but never centered our lives around Him. My parents encouraged me to be self-sufficient, to pursue success, and to forge my own way. While I always believed in God on some abstract level, I never gave much thought to what that really meant. To me, religion was something people turned to when they needed comfort, when they feared death, or when they sought answers that couldn't be found elsewhere. But I didn't see myself as one of those people. I was strong, intelligent, and I believed that life was about making choices that brought me happiness. So, I lived my life on my own terms, making decisions that felt right to me without worrying about whether they fit any spiritual or moral guidelines. I didn't give much thought to purity or whether certain behaviors affected my soul. After all, if something wasn't hurting anyone, why would it be wrong? The world had taught me that self-discovery was key to happiness, that exploring my desires was natural, and that the only thing that mattered was how I felt about my choices. Relationships were temporary, intimacy was casual, and everything around me reinforced the idea that personal satisfaction was the ultimate goal. Yet, despite chasing all the things I was told would make me feel fulfilled, I often felt empty. There was an inexplicable loneliness, a void that relationships couldn't fill and that distractions couldn't quiet. I convinced myself it was normal, that everyone felt this way sometimes, that I just needed to focus on the next thing, the next goal, the next experience, and eventually that feeling would fade. But then everything changed. It was just a normal day, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that should have seemed different from any other. I had woken up, gone through my routine, checked my phone, scrolled through social media, and carried on with my day. I felt fine. No warning signs, no indication that something was about to happen that would change my life forever. But in one moment, without any forewarning, my reality shifted. I remember standing in my kitchen when a sharp pain suddenly shot through my head. So intense that it took my breath away. It wasn't just a headache or a dull ache. It felt as if something inside my skull had exploded, as if my brain had been struck by lightning. My vision blurred, my legs gave way beneath me, and before I could process what was happening, the world around me tilted and faded to black. I heard a distant thud and felt the cold floor against my skin, but everything was slipping away too quickly for me to hold on. I expected unconsciousness to feel like sleep, a simple shutdown of my mind, leaving nothing but silence, darkness, and emptiness. After all, that's what science said happened when the brain stopped working. I always assumed that death, if it came for me, would be a simple ending, like turning off a light switch, a peaceful nothingness. But I was wrong. Instead of fading into oblivion, I became aware of something strange, something that sent a chill through me. Even as my body lay lifeless on the floor, I was still there, still conscious, still thinking. But I wasn't inside my body anymore. I could see everything around me, the way my limbs were spread awkwardly, the way my chest wasn't moving, the way my face remained eerily still. But I was no longer connected to any of it. I felt light, weightless, as if I were floating just above the scene, as if I had been pulled from my physical form and was now observing it from a completely different perspective. There was no pain, no panic, just an overwhelming sense of detachment. I should have been terrified. I should have been screaming in fear. But instead, I felt a deep, sinking realization settle over me. This wasn't a dream. My mind wasn't playing tricks on me. This was real. I wasn't ready to die. As if answering my thoughts, I felt a shift in the air, if I could even call it that. It seemed to grow heavier, thicker, pressing in from all sides. I wasn't alone. There was something, someone, watching me. I couldn't see them, couldn't move in any direction, but I could feel it. An undeniable presence that filled every inch of the space around me. It was unlike anything I had ever known, an energy so powerful that it seemed to reach straight into my soul, pulling at the very core of who I was. I wanted to speak, to call out, to demand answers. But before I could form a single thought, the space around me shifted. The scene of my apartment, my lifeless body, the world I had always known, began to fade. melting away like mist in the morning sun. In its place, something new began to form, something vast, endless, incomprehensible. It was neither light nor dark, neither here nor there, but a place that seemed to exist outside of time, outside of reality itself. And then, in the distance, I saw him. I couldn't explain how I knew who he was. There was no introduction, no need for one. The moment I saw him, every fiber of my being recognized him, not as a stranger, not as a distant religious figure I had heard of, but never truly believed in, but as the one who had always been there, the one who had known me before I even existed. Jesus. The name thundered through my soul, not in sound, but in certainty. I had spent my life ignoring him, doubting him, questioning everything about faith, about morality, about whether anything mattered beyond what we could see and touch and experience in the moment. Yet here he was, standing before me, more real than anything I had ever known. I wanted to run, to hide, to escape the weight of his gaze, because I knew, without him saying a word, that he knew everything. Every thought, every action, every excuse, every justification I had ever made for the way I had lived my life. It was all laid bare before him. I had spent my entire life believing I was in control, that I was free to make my own choices, that nothing I did had any lasting consequence beyond the temporary experiences of this world. But in that moment, standing in the presence of Jesus Christ, I realized the truth. I had been wrong, devastatingly wrong. I thought I was dying, but in reality, I was about to learn the truth about everything. The moment I left my body, I expected darkness, emptiness, nothingness, the silence of a mind shutting down. After all, that's what I had always assumed death would be. But instead, I was still aware, more aware than I had ever been before. I felt weightless, as if my body had been stripped away, yet I still existed. I could see everything, but not with my eyes. It was as if my consciousness had expanded beyond physical limits. I looked down and saw myself lying there, motionless. Doctors and nurses rushed around me, their faces strained, their voices urgent. Machines beeped wildly. I could hear their words, feel the tension in the room. "She's coding. Get the crash cart now. No pulse. Start compressions." Their voices faded, muffled by something far stronger pulling at me. I wasn't tethered to that body anymore. Whatever I had been before, whatever I had built my life upon, was slipping away. The longer I looked, the more I felt the world I had known fading into the distance, as if it was no longer the only reality that existed. Then I felt it, a shift. I wasn't in the hospital anymore. I had no idea how or when it had happened, but I was being drawn into something vast, a realm that stretched endlessly in every direction. The air around me was thick, heavy, charged with something indescribable. It wasn't just space. It was alive. Then I heard them. Whispers. At first, they were faint, like echoes bouncing through the air, too distant to understand. But as I was pulled further in, they grew louder. Voices, hundreds, maybe thousands of them. Some were crying, others pleading, some murmuring words of regret. I didn't know. I thought I had more time. Please let me go back. The words sent a shiver through me. There was something desperate in those voices, something that made my soul tremble. Who were they? Where were they? Were they like me, lost, confused, pulled from the world too soon? A chill settled over me, not from cold, but from the weight of something I couldn't yet see. Then I felt it. A presence. It was approaching from the distance, though distance itself felt meaningless here. It was coming closer, and as it did, every part of me felt exposed. I wasn't alone. I was about to come face to face with the one I had spent my whole life ignoring. The presence before me grew stronger, more overwhelming than anything I had ever felt. It wasn't just power. It was something deeper. Something that reached into the very core of my being. I had spent my entire life denying that something like this could exist. But now, standing in the presence of the one who had always been there, I realized how blind I had been. I looked up, and before me stood Jesus Christ. He wasn't like the paintings, not like the distant, emotionless figure I had seen in church windows or religious imagery. He was real, living, breathing, more solid than anything I had ever encountered. His presence was so powerful, so overwhelming, that I felt like I couldn't stand. Yet at the same time, I couldn't look away. His eyes met mine, and instantly, every excuse, every false belief, every justification I had ever told myself shattered into nothing. I wanted to speak, to explain, to say something. But what could I say? What excuse could I offer to the one who knew everything? Before a single word could escape my lips, the truth washed over me like a tidal wave. I saw my life flash before me, not just as memories, but as if every single choice I had ever made was laid bare. There was no hiding here, no pretending. I saw myself as I had always been. The things I had done in secret, the thoughts I had dismissed as meaningless, the choices I had justified as harmless. And I realized that none of it had been harmless. Jesus didn't need to say anything for me to understand. I saw it all every time I ignored that quiet voice inside me, telling me something wasn't right. Every time I mocked those who took faith seriously, calling them narrow-minded, outdated, or brainwashed. Every time I chose my desires over something deeper, something more meaningful, something I refused to acknowledge. But what struck me the hardest, what shook me to my core, was that Jesus wasn't looking at me with anger or condemnation. He was grieving. His eyes were filled with sorrow, sorrow so profound, so overwhelming, it broke me more than if he had shouted or condemned me outright. He mourned for me, for the life I had wasted, for the years spent chasing things that never fulfilled me, for the choices I had made, the ones I convinced myself didn't matter, the ones I justified as part of being human. Then, at last, he spoke. "Sarah." My soul trembled. "You never knew me." Tears welled up in my eyes as my chest tightened. I wanted to argue, to say that I had believed in God, that I had never outright denied his existence, but I couldn't, because deep down, I knew the truth. Believing in God wasn't the same as knowing him, and I had never truly known him. Jesus moved closer, and I felt my soul quiver beneath his presence. He wasn't just confronting me. He was revealing the truth. Many think their choices only affect their bodies, he said, but they don't understand that their actions impact their souls. I saw it not only in my own life, but in the lives of countless others. I saw people trapped in cycles of sin, thinking their private actions had no consequences. I saw how the world had normalized impurity, indulgence, and selfish desires, convincing people it was natural, healthy, or just part of life. I saw how people sought pleasure to fill a void that only God could fill. I saw the loneliness, the spiritual decay, the way people chased fleeting satisfaction but were never truly whole. And worst of all, I saw the chains. They were everywhere, wrapped around people who thought they were free, binding them in ways they didn't even realize. People thought they were simply exploring their identity, following their desires, believing that because they weren't hurting anyone, it couldn't be wrong. But the chains were there, spiritual, invisible to the human eye. Jesus turned to me, his face full of sorrow, yet his voice steady. "Your body is a temple," he said, "but it was never meant to be worshipped. It was never meant to be misused." I collapsed to my knees, my soul shattering under the weight of that truth. I had spent my entire life believing my choices were mine alone, that as long as I wasn't hurting anyone, I was free to do whatever I wanted. But I had been wrong, so terribly wrong. And I wasn't the only one. Jesus raised his hand, and suddenly I saw the world through his eyes. I saw how people had twisted the purpose of their bodies, turning what was meant to be sacred into something selfish. I saw how marriages were suffering, relationships growing empty, how people filled their lives with distractions, having forgotten what true love was meant to be. I saw how intimacy had been reduced to something casual, meaningless, pursued without understanding its spiritual weight. I saw how sin had been repackaged as self-discovery, how the world had been deceived into believing that pleasure was life's highest goal. And I wept. I wept because I had believed the lie. I wept because I had lived it. And I wept because so many others were still blind to the truth. Then Jesus spoke again. "I did not come to condemn. I came to set you free." I lifted my eyes, my breath catching. There was no anger in his face, only love. Love so deep, so boundless, that it shattered every fear, every doubt, every excuse I had ever made. I had expected judgment, rejection, but instead, Jesus was offering me something else. Something I didn't deserve, something I had never even thought to ask for. Mercy. I was completely undone. Then Jesus spoke the words that shook me to my very core. But you must choose, Sarah. The vision before me shifted, and suddenly I was no longer standing in his overwhelming presence. Instead, I was shown a reality I had never considered, as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes, and I was seeing the world as God sees it. At first, everything seemed normal, familiar scenes of everyday life. People going about their routines, living their lives, unaware of anything beyond the present moment. But then, as I watched, I began to notice something deeply unsettling. People were surrounded by chains. I saw men and women walking through busy streets, sitting in their homes, scrolling through their phones, laughing with friends, working at their jobs. Yet every one of them, every single one, was bound. Some had chains wrapped around their wrists, others around their ankles, some around their entire bodies. But they couldn't see them. They moved freely, oblivious to the invisible weight dragging behind them. They thought they were free, living as they pleased, following their own desires. But in truth, they were enslaved. I felt my stomach tighten as I realized what I was witnessing. I saw people alone in their rooms, consumed by addictions they never spoke of. I saw men and women convincing themselves that it was harmless, that it didn't matter, that they weren't hurting anyone. I saw young people being taught that their bodies were meant for their own pleasure, that self-indulgence was normal, and that discipline was outdated. I saw how purity was mocked. Then I saw the consequences. Jesus' voice echoed in my spirit. Your body is a temple. It was never meant to be misused. At that moment, the vision changed again, and I saw something that made my soul tremble. I saw people praying, crying out to God, desperate for healing, freedom, and peace. I saw them kneeling in churches, begging for their faith to be restored, wondering why they felt distant from God, why their prayers seemed empty, why they couldn't hear His voice. But then I saw what was holding them back. Sin had built a wall between them and God, not because God had abandoned them, but because they had clung to the very things that separated them from Him. Lust, indulgence, compromise, choosing pleasure over holiness, their desires over God's will. They wanted peace, but they weren't willing to let go of what kept them enslaved. Tears burned in my eyes as I watched. I had always believed that if something felt good, it couldn't be all that bad. I had bought into the lie that personal happiness was the highest goal, that as long as I wasn't hurting anyone, I was free to do whatever I wanted. But now, for the first time, I saw the truth. The world had told me that purity was oppression, that self-control was unnecessary, that my body was mine to do with as I pleased. But Jesus showed me this was never God's design. I saw how marriages had been broken, how families had fallen apart, how people had lost the ability to connect with one another because their understanding of love had been twisted. I saw how young people were taught to chase experiences instead of seeking wisdom. I saw how the media, culture, and influencers all fed the same message. Do what makes you happy, follow your desires, you deserve it. But they never showed what came after. They never showed the emptiness, the shame, the regret, the isolation. They never showed the chains. Jesus spoke again, and His words cut through me like a blade. The world tells you that freedom means doing whatever you desire, but true freedom is found in me. I looked at Him, my heart racing. I had spent my entire life believing that religion was about rules, restrictions, limitations. I thought purity was a burden carried out of guilt, but now I understood. Purity wasn't about rules, it was about protection. Self-control wasn't about limitation, it was about freedom. God wasn't trying to keep people from happiness, He was trying to protect them from destruction. I had always thought my choices, what I watched, what I did in private, what I allowed into my heart, didn't matter. But now I saw the truth. Everything I had been told about harmless pleasure was a lie. Jesus turned to me, and in His eyes I saw not condemnation, but deep, sorrowful love. You must warn them. he said. "They do not see what is coming." The vision before me grew heavier, more vivid, as if my soul were being pulled into the depths of a truth I had never dared to face. Jesus stood beside me, his presence overwhelming, yet filled with sorrow. I could feel his grief, not for himself, but for the people who were blind to what was happening to them. I turned my gaze back to the images unfolding before me, and what I saw next made my heart sink. At first, I saw individuals, men and women, each alone, surrounded by an eerie, suffocating darkness. They were moving, but something was wrong. Their expressions were hollow, their eyes distant, their bodies tense as if carrying invisible weights. Some were glued to their screens, trapped in an endless cycle of indulgence that offered momentary satisfaction but left them emptier each time. Others were drowning in secret habits, telling themselves, "Just one more time, just one more time," while shame coiled around them like an iron chain. I could see guilt eating away at them, but instead of turning away from what harmed them, they kept returning, believing it was the only thing that could comfort them. But it never did. I saw relationships, husbands and wives drifting apart, once strong marriages now reduced to polite strangers living under the same roof. I saw loneliness settle between them like an ever-growing chasm, a wall neither could break through. I saw young men and women, their understanding of love completely distorted, seeing people as objects rather than souls. They chased experience after experience without realizing they were losing pieces of themselves. I saw isolation. I saw despair. And then I saw the chains. Some were small, barely visible, wrapped around wrists and ankles. Others were massive, binding people so tightly they couldn't even lift their heads. I realized something horrifying. The people I was seeing didn't even know they were bound. They thought they were free. I turned to Jesus, my voice trembling. "They don't see it, do they?" His face was filled with sorrow. "No," he said softly. "The greatest deception is convincing someone they are free when they are in bondage." Tears burned in my eyes as I observed people navigating life, making decisions they believed were harmless, unaware that with every choice they were crafting their own chains. Then I witnessed something even more alarming. These unseen chains followed people into their faith. I saw individuals in churches singing, praying, and raising their hands in worship, yet still bound. Among them were preachers standing at pulpits, sharing messages of hope and joy, though I could see the burdens they carried in secret. Others were worship leaders, their voices strong and their songs beautiful, yet battling inner struggles they had resigned themselves to losing. They had stopped fighting entirely. Most heartbreaking of all, I saw those who had completely given up, convinced that God didn't care about their private lives. They reshaped their faith to align with their desires, still claiming his name and calling themselves Christians. Yet their lives remained unsurrendered. Jesus spoke again, his voice filled with both authority and sorrow. "Sin isn't about rules. It's about what separates you from me." Suddenly, I understood. God's commandments weren't arbitrary rules meant to control us, but warnings, boundaries meant to keep his children from destruction. The world, however, had twisted these warnings into jokes. Words like purity, holiness, obedience, and self-control had become outdated ideas, mocked and dismissed. But what I was witnessing wasn't metaphorical or a religious argument. It was reality. People were suffering, unaware of the reason. Overwhelmed, I fell to my knees, feeling the weight of it all. "Jesus," I whispered, "how can they escape this?" He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw hope. Then the vision shifted. I saw people breaking free. Men and women fell to their knees, crying out to God, not from guilt or fear, but from a deep hunger to be free. They repented, not out of fear of punishment, but because they realized what they had lost. I saw chains shatter. Marriages were restored, with husbands and wives turning back to each other, their eyes filled with love instead of resentment. I saw young men and women choosing purity, holiness, and paths that honored God instead of themselves. I saw former addicts standing before others, sharing testimonies of how God had freed them. Then, something even more extraordinary happened. I saw God's presence filling these people in a way I'd never seen before. They were no longer Christians in name only. They were alive. I had spent my life thinking faith was about following rules, assuming those who spoke about sin were judgmental and controlling. But now, I knew the truth. God wasn't trying to control us. He was trying to set us free. Jesus turned to me, and for the first time since the vision began, I felt peace. Now you see, he said, the choice is theirs, compromise or purity, chains or freedom, a life of deception or a life in me. His eyes met mine with a depth that shook my soul. You must choose too. At that moment, I knew my life would never be the same. The vision shifted again. The chains, despair, and brokenness I had witnessed faded away, replaced by something entirely different. It was beautiful, radiant, alive, and filled with a warmth that reached into my soul. I didn't need Jesus to explain. I felt it and knew. What I saw left me breathless. I saw love, real love, the kind the world had tried to mimic but could never fully grasp. Husbands and wives stood together, hands intertwined, their eyes reflecting a deep, pure connection. They weren't just together, they were united. Families were full of joy, laughter, and peace. They weren't perfect or free from struggles, but built on something unshakable. There was honor and respect binding them. I saw young people guarding their hearts, minds, and bodies, not out of fear or repression, but because they understood their worth. A lump rose in my throat. This was what love was meant to be. Jesus spoke again, his voice filled with longing and sorrow. This is my design. My heart pounded. But this, I whispered, isn't what the world looks like. This isn't what people experience. He nodded. The world has taken what was sacred and made it selfish. The vision shifted once more. Now, I saw people chasing love, but never finding it. Relationships that began with passion dissolved into resentment, betrayal, and emptiness. People used one another, viewing love as something to take rather than give. Marriages crumbled, not because love disappeared, but because it had never been real. People believed they were free to follow their desires and hearts, but they were slaves. Slaves to their desires, the need to be wanted, and the fear of being alone. The world had lied to them about what love truly was. My heart broke. Why is it like this? I asked, my voice trembling. Jesus looked at me, his eyes full of sorrow. Because they have forgotten me. Tears burned in my eyes. I had spent my life believing love was about attraction, compatibility, and convenience, never considering holiness or purpose. Now, I saw the truth. Love was never meant to be selfish or temporary. It was meant to reflect something greater. Jesus lifted his hand, and suddenly I saw a wedding unlike any I had ever imagined. It wasn't focused on decorations, expensive dresses, or perfect pictures. It was divine. A bride, dressed in white, walked toward her groom without fear, hesitation, or doubt, only love, trust, and pure devotion. I turned to Jesus, a realization hitting me like a wave. This isn't just about marriage, is it? I whispered. This is about you. Jesus smiled, and something deep within me awakened. Everything became clear. Marriage, intimacy, and love were meant to reflect our relationship with Him. A husband's sacrificial, faithful love for his wife mirrored how Jesus loves us. A wife's trust and devotion to her husband mirrored how we are meant to trust God. But the world had corrupted this. Love was no longer seen as holy or permanent, but as temporary and disposable. People wanted the feeling of love without commitment, intimacy without responsibility, and pleasure without sacrifice. As a result, they were never satisfied. What the world calls freedom is actually slavery, Jesus said, his voice firm yet tender. True freedom is found in me. Tears streamed down my face. I had believed freedom meant doing whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted, but that wasn't freedom. Freedom was surrender. Freedom was choosing love that wasn't selfish. Freedom was trusting God with my heart instead of trying to control everything. I looked at Jesus, my voice shaky. How do they find this? How do people return to what you designed? His expression was gentle, yet resolute. They must choose me. Then I saw it. Broken people being healed. Marriages restored. Families rebuilt. Hearts made whole. People who once chased the world now sought God, finding everything they had ever longed for. I saw people falling to their knees, surrendering their past, laying down their desires, and choosing holiness over convenience, obedience over comfort. They didn't lose themselves. They became who they were always meant to be. At that moment, I understood the truth I had been missing my entire life. The vision shifted again. No longer was I seeing love and relationships as they were meant to be. Now, I witnessed something even more powerful: redemption. At first, I didn't fully grasp what I was seeing. People stood in darkness, but this wasn't the suffocating darkness of chains. It was the darkness of regret, shame, and brokenness. Men and women bowed their heads, their shoulders heavy with sorrow. Some had carried the weight of their mistakes for years, even decades. Others had been hurt, betrayed, or abandoned. Many believed they were beyond saving. Then, in the distance, a light appeared. It wasn't just any light. It was alive, warm, and powerful. As it grew brighter, something incredible happened. The people in darkness lifted their heads. Some hesitated, unsure if they could approach. Others fell to their knees, weeping, hands raised in surrender. They weren't running or hiding. They were coming home. As they moved toward the light, their chains began to fall. At first, it was slow, a single link breaking, a single shackle loosening. Then, an unseen force ripped the chains apart, sending them crashing to the ground. Some had been so heavily bound that I hadn't realized the extent of their captivity until the chains fell away. Suddenly, they were free. Tears streamed down my face as I watched. I had noticed the chains before. I had observed how they formed, how they coiled tightly around people's souls, and how they grew more constricting each time someone succumbed to sin, prioritizing their desires over God. However, I had never witnessed what happened when those chains shattered. Turning to Jesus, my voice quivered. How are they being set free? His face radiated a love so profound and overwhelming that it was almost unbearable to look at him. Because they chose me, he replied softly. Because they surrendered, let go of their shame, and reached for my grace. I swallowed hard as I watched more people stepping into the light. Their chains fell away, their faces lifted, and their eyes sparkled with hope, a hope that had been absent in the darkness. Those trapped in shame weren't hopeless. They had only believed they were. They had spent their lives convinced their sins were too heavy, their mistakes too many, their pasts too broken. Yet the truth was now undeniable. No one was beyond redemption. No one was out of reach for grace. Jesus stepped forward, and his presence swept through the scene like a rushing wind. The people standing in the light turned toward him, and something extraordinary happened. They weren't just liberated, they were made whole. It was something I had never seen before. My entire life, I had assumed that broken people remained broken, even if they found healing. I believed scars were inevitable. But these people weren't merely forgiven, they were completely restored. I could see it in their posture, in their eyes. They had been renewed. Jesus turned back to me, his voice gentle yet filled with conviction. I did not come to condemn, he said, but to heal. I had spent so much of my life perceiving God as a strict judge, someone keeping score, waiting for failures, ready to punish rule breakers. But now I saw the truth. God wasn't searching for perfect people. He was looking for those willing to surrender, to acknowledge they couldn't save themselves, and to let him rewrite their story. I turned to the vision again, my heart aching as I saw more people step into the light. Some had been running for years, but the moment they stopped and turned toward Jesus, he welcomed them with open arms. He wasn't angry. He had been waiting for them. A tidal wave of realization crashed over me. I had been running too, not in blatant rebellion, not in outright denial of God, but in subtler ways. My entire being trembled as I turned to Jesus and asked, "What do you want me to do?" His eyes, filled with love and urgency, met mine. "You must go back," he said. The weight of his words hit me. My breath caught. Go back? Jesus stepped closer, and I felt the gravity of the moment pressing upon me. "You must tell them what you've seen," he continued. "You must warn them." Show them there is still hope, that there is still time. Panic swelled in my chest. But I don't want to go back, I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. How could I return to a world so blind to this reality? How could I live among people trapped by chains they couldn't even see? People who mocked the very thing that could set them free. Jesus placed his hand on my shoulder, and a profound peace washed over me. You are not alone, he said. I will be with you. But you must go back. You must choose. The enormity of those words settled over me, leaving me with no choice. If I had truly been transformed, if I had genuinely learned the truth, I couldn't stay silent. This wasn't just a dream. It was real. Before I could respond, before I could plead or take one last look, everything began to fade. The light, the people, and Jesus. And then, I knew I was going back. When I woke up, it felt as though I had been torn from another world. My body ached in ways I had never experienced. Every muscle felt heavy. My lungs burned with every breath, and my head throbbed. For a brief moment, I was completely disoriented. The harsh beeping of machines and flickering fluorescent lights greeted me. I heard distant voices, nurses adjusting monitors, doctors speaking softly. As I blinked, my vision blurred, and memories came rushing back. The chains, the vision, the people crying out in darkness, those who surrendered and found freedom, and Jesus. The reality of what I had just witnessed overwhelmed me. The hospital, the machines, the doctors, none of it mattered. What I had experienced was far more vivid, far more real. Suddenly, the door burst open. My mother rushed in, her face pale and tear-streaked. The moment she saw me awake, she let out a sob and gripped my hand tightly. "Oh my God, Sarah, you're awake!" she cried. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. How could I possibly explain something so profound? How could I describe something beyond human comprehension? The doctor entered, flipping through a clipboard, his expression one of disbelief. You shouldn't be here," he murmured. "Medically speaking, this is impossible." I just stared at him. Of course, it was impossible, but I had seen the impossible. A nurse adjusted the IV in my arm and spoke gently. "Sweetheart, you've been unconscious for days. Severe trauma, brain trauma. We didn't think you'd wake up, but here you are. A miracle," they said without saying it. But I already knew. I gripped my mother's hand, my voice weak yet certain. "I saw Jesus." The room fell silent. My mother's grip tightened. "Baby, you were unconscious," she said. "You were probably dreaming." "No," I interrupted, my voice gaining strength. "It wasn't a dream. It was real." And so, I told them everything. The chains, the people, the darkness, and the light. I spoke through tears, knowing they couldn't fully grasp it. When I finished, the room was silent. The doctor glanced at his clipboard, clearly unsure how to respond. The nurse offered a sympathetic smile. But my mother? She just stared at me and whispered, "I believe you." Tears spilled down my face. "I have to tell people," I said. "They don't see what's happening. They don't realize they're not free." She held me close. "Oh, baby, he gave you back to us," she whispered. For the first time, I understood. Jesus hadn't sent me back for myself. He had sent me back for them. Leaving the hospital, the world looked the same, yet everything had changed. People walked by, unaware of the spiritual battle surrounding them. I couldn't stay silent. At first, I didn't know where to start. But then I remembered Jesus' words. You must choose. I couldn't force others to believe, but I could share my story. Some listened, others mocked. Yet I persisted, knowing even one soul turning to Jesus would make it all worth it. This isn't about rules or shame. It's about freedom, real freedom. Seek Jesus, choose him, and you will never be the same.